Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get settled in here for what's going to be a very exciting next hour. I'd like to welcome you to, I think, what is the fifth in our series? Is it the fifth of this? Yeah, it's been a remarkable series, but today is truly exceptional. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Julian Ford, a professor of psychiatry at University of Connecticut School of Medicine. He is a board-certified psychologist and a leader of really amazing, not just outstanding, but amazing stature in the field of traumatic stress research, treatment, and advocacy. Some of you may have also learned that he is an Ann Arbor native, which I learned very recently. And students may have learned in events earlier today that he began his career as a young man in working at the old Ypsilanti State Hospital. So that must bring back some memories for you, Julian. He is a tireless translational scholar working to deepen understanding of developmental trauma disorder in youth, developing treatment programs, and leading creation of treatment guidelines for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. He's currently the director of 2 SAMHSA-funded centers, and I'm going to leave it to him to tell us a bit more about them, but they're both enormously impressive. He's also, as you would expect, a very prolific author and an editor of at least 3 U.S. and European journals in the field of trauma that I could count. He could boast if he wished. Doesn't strike me as a boaster, but at least 10 books and more than 250 papers. I'd also like to take this opportunity to congratulate him on his recent election to be president of the International Society for Trauma Stress Studies. And I gently roll my eyes because those jobs are always huge, important, and they are labors of love. So they have much to offer and much to demand. Julian, welcome. It is wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dina. It's a pleasure. Thank you. Well, it's very nice to see all of you, and I really want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here and to have met with the Cascade Research Group, which is Dr. Julia Singh's group, and all of those of you who are part of that group, who are just coming in as well. That's great. So let's talk about what is developmental trauma anyway. And if you're not familiar with Cascade Group, I won't get it exactly right, but it has to do with childhood adversity, so adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs. If you don't know that study, then you probably haven't been at any of these other presentations, but if you do know that study, you know that that's a study that was done more than 20 years ago, and it's been replicated a number of times, that basically shows that the more types of adversity that a child experiences in their growing up, the more likely that they are, in a very dose-response way, that I will show you a chart on in a moment, the more likely they are to have adverse problems throughout their entire lives, not just in childhood, not just in adolescence, not even just in early adulthood, but throughout their lives. And those include not only behavioral health problems, depression, anxiety, substance use problems, suicidality, but also physical health problems, serious illnesses. And that's not to suggest that adversity in childhood causes illness. It contributes, however, to the risk of physical illness. It creates a strain. And that's part of what I've been trying to figure out. How should we understand that? What is it that happens to children when they experience traumatic events in their childhood? What changes? And as a result, what can we do about that? So I'll give you a little bit of a guided tour on that and what I've learned over the last 25 years or so. And I have to admit that I do have a commercial interest, which I will not be promoting today whatsoever, but I am part of a company that was established by the University of Connecticut to disseminate an intervention that I'll be telling you about that is to help traumatized children, their parents, and traumatized adults. So when you think about childhood adversities, and let's think about adversities lifetime. So it's not just in childhood, but we'll focus especially on childhood. There are so many ways in which any of us can experience profound adversity. And this is just a daunting, but actually a short list. And hopefully, most of us will never experience any of these types of potentially traumatic events or traumatic experiences. but 60% of the US population and approximately 60% of adolescents, not just adults, have experienced at least one of these types of potentially traumatic exposure and very serious adversity. And this is not even a complete listing of the kinds of adversity that are included in the Adverse Childhood Experiences screening form. That also includes parents who are impaired by mental illness, by substance abuse problems, as a result of legal or criminal justice problems. So it also includes kids who are not directly threatened with violence or who do not directly experience violence, but who do not have adequate protection and who also often don't have the kind of fundamental caregiving that we know is essential to develop many, many crucial inner capacities and to develop relationships over the lifespan. Now, that doesn't mean that children who experience traumatic events or adversity are in any way fundamentally impaired in their abilities to learn, to develop, to be intelligent, to grow, to succeed. But they're operating at a disadvantage because part of their fundamental resources, their inner resources and often their external resources, their capacities to grow and develop, are occupied with something that those who've not experienced this adversity don't have to pay attention to or contend with, and that is survival. And if you just think about that, what would it be like to grow up where you truly didn't know if you would make it through the next day, or you truly did not know if your parents, your family members were going to be there the next day? That's the kind of survival threat that would leave anybody to be focused on much more than just enjoying life and doing well in school and having friendships. It creates a whole nother range of concerns that then really become a potential disorder. But they all fundamentally begin not with any deficit in the individual. They begin with an adaptive shift that is essentially a very basic shift, biological as well as psychological and behavioral, to survive. So let's talk about what that looks like. Well, first of all, as I mentioned, more than 60% of children are exposed to victimization every year. More than 60% of adolescents have had at least one threat to their life or their survival or to that of someone who they care about and who they depend upon for their protection and their caregiving. So this is not a limited problem. This is not, unfortunately, something that is outside the range of ordinary human experience. It's very much within the range of ordinary human experience. It's just that, fortunately, it doesn't happen all the time, but it can happen at any time. And the ACEs study, just one snapshot from some of their earlier findings, where you can see that with every type of adversity that an adult, in this case, reports having experienced in their childhood, every type of adversity then translates, into a higher risk of alcohol abuse in adulthood, a higher risk of suicide attempts, and a higher risk of severe anxiety. And that's, again, just a short list of the problems. Those are just some of the most debilitating. But there are also equally high dose-response relationship risks with physical illnesses, including cardiovascular, pulmonary, metabolic, immunological, oncological, cancers even. So adversity then can have a lifetime impact. And it's particularly true, but what I've focused on are kids who are not just experiencing a traumatic event or even a series of traumatic events, but multiple types of victimization. And that has been the term that's been coined by David Finkelhor, who's a researcher at the University of New Hampshire, is polyvictimization. And what we found well, actually what Dr. Finkelhor first found in a survey that he does every several years of a nationally representative sample of children, is that 22%, so almost 1 in 4, had experienced 4 or more types of victimization. Not incidents, but types. Bullying, community violence, domestic violence, assault, witnessing assaults, losses, traumatic losses. 4 or more types in the past year, and this is just kids across the board. These are not kids who are high risk. This is a nationally representative sample. We found that in a sample of U.S. teens, we did some secondary analyses of the National Survey of Adolescents, a study that was done about 20 years ago, and we found that 8%, so 1 in 12, had experienced an average of between 5 to 10 types of potentially traumatic events and victimization in their lifetimes. Types, not incidents. And in that sample, 10% were polyvictims. In the Finkelhor sample, 10% were polyvictims at age 9, at ages 3 to 6, that group of polyvictims had experienced on average between 9 or more types of victimization. By age 15, the polyvictim group, the group of kids who had experienced the most victimization, had experienced 15 different types of victimization in their young lives. And we found that we could actually identify in this sample of adolescents a polyvictim group that I mentioned earlier, and they had experienced 6 to 11 different types of traumatic victimization. They were also at high risk for PTSD, but not only post-traumatic stress disorder, forgive me if you're not familiar with that acronym, but also depression and problems with delinquency. So these are kids who are not just feeling anxious. They are feeling stressed and feeling as though they are at risk and that they're having to resort to extreme means to cope. This is a very busy chart that just shows you, if you look at each one of these lines is one of a group, is a subgroup of this sample of adolescents, identified empirically using latent class analyses, a statistical technique. And you can see that the group with the dotted lines has enormously high probabilities. These are the probabilities of exposure to different types of traumatic events, with 100% here. Some of these events that involve basically lack of protection and danger, almost 100% of those kids, in fact, 100% of those kids had actually experienced those types of victimization. And then that group had experienced high levels of multiple other types of victimization, including sexual victimization. So this is a group that isn't just experiencing an accident here, an accident there, a terrible disaster, as bad as those are, but also physical violence and even sexual violence. So what do kids do when they experience a threat to their life or to the lives of those who they care about? Well, they cope to survive. And how do they do that? Well, they do that in a lot of ways that are very inconvenient for us as adults and for society in general. And they do it in ways that are often lead them to experience even more adversity, because now they can become labeled as juvenile delinquents, as callous and unemotional, as the problem kids who you just don't even want in your classroom or you certainly don't want in your clinic. And yet these are kids who they're reacting aggressively to protect themselves. They're singling out peers who also are involved in delinquency in many cases, because those are the peers who will accept them and who understand what they've experienced. They're often labeled as oppositional and defiant or impulsive. They often get diagnosed with attention deficit disorder or ADHD. They'll also often get diagnosed with pre-adult borderline personality disorder. These are kids who are tough to get along with in many cases, but they're also the smartest kids that I know. They're kids like one boy who I met when he came into our child trauma clinic, who his opening line to me was, "Well, Doc, I know you want to talk about goals. I don't have any goals. I don't do goals. Are we done?" I kid you not. I couldn't make that up. I won't reveal his name, but he's given me permission to tell you that. Another boy who said to me, "You know what, Doc? You're well-intended." I don't think he said that. Your heart's in the right place, but you're from the suburbs. You don't know my life. And he's absolutely right. He was completely right. That doesn't mean that I couldn't be helpful to him, but he was basically, both of these young men were basically telling me, make no assumptions. If I seem oppositional or defiant, maybe it's because I'm actually having to do something to push back. Maybe I need to protect myself or stand up for my friends. Maybe that's why I get expelled from class, because I don't like the way the teacher talks to my cousin, another one of my clients, my youthful clients who kept getting expelled because the teacher kept singling out his cousin who had some learning difficulties, and she kept doing it in a way that he perceived as very humiliating. And so he stood up for his cousin and got labeled as a troublemaker. That's not at all unusual. These are often kids who are speaking up against injustice, against hypocrisy, kids who say, you adults tell us to do one thing, but how come you don't have to do the same thing? You can react any way you want to. These are kids who sometimes the only way that they know how to cope with the intense emotional distress that they feel, especially at private times, like at times where they would want to sleep and just can't sleep, or times where things are quiet and there isn't a lot of distractions and stimuli, they'll often, unfortunately, experience such distress that they'll engage in self-harm. And you should know, if you don't, that when kids or adults harm themselves, like cutting or burning or beating themselves in any way, shape, or form, or reckless behavior, that in many cases, if not most, this is not to hurt themselves. It's to actually focus the pain and the distress they're feeling, because physical pain or the adrenaline rush of reckless behavior is a lot more tolerable than a diffuse sense of distress and hopelessness. And that's what many of these kids are coping with. They've come to believe that their lives are relatively hopeless, that they are damaged goods. They will often even say that. They've come to believe that there's something wrong with them, because why would it always be happening to them? And of course, it's not anything about them in most cases. They may draw some unwanted attention. They may provoke conflict. But in most cases, this is because they've been subjected to so much conflict that they're just trying to make a statement. This can't keep going on, but I don't know what else to do. All right, so this is probably not encouraging you to think that this is going to be very hopeful, but I think we need to start with the hard truth, and as much as possible get into the heads and the bodies of these kids, because otherwise we're never going to be able to connect with them. I'm sure you know that, okay? Even then, it's going to be difficult. And of course, then they get often diagnosed with a wide array of other kinds of psychiatric and behavioral problems. And again, many of these are fundamentally because they're just trying to survive an inner sense of turmoil that they don't think anyone else can understand, because who else could possibly be experiencing it? Well, tragically, maybe many other kids. Whoops. Let's go forward. And I would submit to you that while I don't want to oversimplify, that we have to sometimes just bring it down and keep it simple, smart. And I think that what we're really talking about here are kids and adults as they go on into adulthood who are dealing with life basically on the basis of survival coping, and I would suggest to you that that involves three primary components. It's not, I can't absolutely prove that to you, but these are the three consistent themes. The first is hypervigilance. Well, if you'd had multiple types of victimization and or abandonment, rejection, betrayal, exploitation, injury, losses happen in your life, you'd probably be on edge too, and you'd probably want to make sure that you didn't get caught blindsided again. And that's a common theme for people who are trauma survivors, but especially kids who've experienced multiple forms of victimization and trauma. They're not hypervigilant because they can't relax or because they can't focus their attention. They're hypervigilant because it's too anxiety-provoking to not be ready for the next shoe to fall. And even if that means being on edge all the time or most of the time, that feels a lot safer than letting down your guard. They also then are often going to react with the best defense, which is sometimes a good offense, and that's reactive aggression. But many times, as I said earlier, that's protest. That is not an intent to help, or excuse me, to hurt. One of the girls who I met at our Children's State Hospital, I come from Connecticut, which is very small, and we have one Children's State Hospital, and this young woman, she did one of the things that is most just awful for the staff. It's scary, and it's just kind of horrific to think about this. She saved up a bunch of her urine and she threw it in the face of a staff member when she was really angry at that staff member. And all the staff were saying, this is not reactive. She planned this. This was premeditated. She had a plan. She did something on purpose. She wanted to hurt this staff member. Well, of course, tragically, the staff member, and this is not a given, but in this case, as not uncommonly, the staff member had been particularly hard on this girl and had had a kind of an agenda of pointing out all of her faults and making sure that she knew exactly when she wasn't doing what she should be doing. So she was constantly, forgive my French, pissing off this particular kid. And that's what then this girl said, you know, if you're going to do that to me, you're going to throw that in my face, I'll throw this back in your face. This does not justify that behavior. And nobody in any way, shape, or form said, okay, we give you a pass on that because, you know, you're just trying to express yourself and that's okay. No, this was treated very seriously, but the issue for her was not just anger management, and not that she was a vindictive, vengeful, or a hurtful person who wanted to do things to cause pain. It was that she was trying to make a statement, and she literally could not find any other way to do that. And our job was to help her find a way to make that statement and not have to make it in that same extreme fashion. Okay, and ultimately, it's grounded in a sense of hopelessness, that there just isn't any reason to think that the future is going to get any better, so you just go on from day to day, which is not living. And very often, these are the kinds of things that kids will say in one way or another. It's a little bit adult language, but I can't stop and think. I can't think past the immediate problem or whatever is in my face right now. I definitely can't let go of any grudges or resentments, because if you do that, then you're weak and you're going to be taken advantage of. I can't stick with or set or stick with goals because I've got another goal. Oops. I've got a more fundamental goal than getting my schoolwork, my homework done. My goal is just trying to get through the next day or the next hour, or hoping that my father doesn't beat up my mother, or hoping that my brother doesn't get shot when we're out walking in the community. Again, I'm telling you a lot of the more extreme situations, but they're unfortunately not that uncommon either. And of course, if you're feeling that way, it's very difficult to trust anyone, and then you're very likely to trust people you can't actually trust, because you can't really distinguish who's trustworthy and who's not. So now you're in a bind where, and this is where kids who've been traumatized often find themselves, they start to trust people who basically play them. And sometimes this can lead to the worst possible consequences, like sex trafficking or just other forms of exploitation. Again, it's not for lack of fundamental judgment, but if you really don't know if you can trust somebody, and if your experience is in some ways that when somebody says they're going to help you, or they care about you, or they're there for you, that you can pretty much expect that they will let you down. And they may even turn around and become your worst adversary, your worst enemy. Under those circumstances, it's very difficult for anyone to believe that they can trust. And then you become desperate to try to trust anyone you can. And as one of the boys who we heard about, we didn't actually meet him, when we were working with an agency up in Canada that works with First Nations communities, this clinical director told my wife this story about a boy who kept coming back in for anger management. He was court-ordered, and there was an anger management group that this particular clinician ran. And this was like the third or the fourth time that this young man had been ordered back for more anger management. And the clinician said to him, "Why are you coming back for anger management? You know more about anger management than I do. You could teach this class better than I could. Why don't you use your anger management skills?" And the young man said, "Oh, I can use my anger management skills anytime except when I'm angry." And that's when the clinical director called us and said, "I want to find a way to help these kids who have the skills but can't use them, because there's something missing. If we're teaching them all these wonderful skills and ways to think better and ways to be healthier in their bodies and ways to handle their emotions, but they still have these intense eruptions of emotion or shutdowns where their prefrontal cortex just seems to go offline, we need some help with that." Okay, So how do we think about that? Well, obviously, there are many ways that this has become clearly known to be a major social issue. Dropout Nation is just one example from a few years ago. And here's a way that we're trying to think about this in the traumatic stress field, to be a little bit more organized rather than just giving you long lists. So what is it that's changed for these kids, okay? Well, we think that it's probably fundamentally the result of a combination of two key factors. Number one, a threat to their lives or survival, or that of those of who they depend upon or care about, okay? So a traumatic shock and victimization, which calls into question their willingness to trust any human being because of the possibility of being compromised or hurt, and a fundamental disruption in attachment, in that sense of secure bonding with primary caregiver or caregivers that is at the core of not just anger management, but all kinds of emotion regulation. To be able to actually calm oneself down when one gets anxious, for any of us. So much of that goes back to our earliest years, and we don't have to have perfect caregivers or parents for this to have occurred, but they have to have been present enough, reliably enough, and responsively enough so that we actually get the sense of our bodies calming down when we begin to get fractious, or our bodies being able to kind of increase our activation level when we start to get fatigued and tired, or be able to rest when that's the case. So these are kids who fundamentally feel unsafe, and they don't have a sense of connection that's strong in a way that gives them the security that we all depend upon in order to be able to get through really scary, hard times. As a result of that, then it seems as though there's three fundamental changes that occur with all these lists. And the first there's a fundamental shift in how these kids and adults regulate their emotions and their bodies. And this includes an inability to both modulate or tolerate extreme states of emotion, which may be physiological. They may not actually be felt as emotions. They may be intense physical states of arousal or intense physical shutdown, okay? So this has a very biological and physiological aspect. It's not just in the head or just in the mind. It's also a difficulty with recovering from those extreme states. So it's one thing to have an extreme state of distress. We all do from time to time. When, where I come from, really bad traffic. I understand that's not the case around here, but I think it may still be. Deadlines, situations in our relationships where we're all frazzled. Any of us can have extreme emotion states, but we are all blessed for the most part with the ability sooner or later to recover. If you've experienced this kind of traumatic victimization and fundamental disruption in attachment bonding, it's just very difficult to come back to baseline. And that's a fundamental problem. Because if you can't come back to baseline, you can't really get along with yourself or anyone else. This often takes the form also of lack of awareness of body states and just of self, which technically is dissociation. But it's fundamentally this lack of awareness because you're too busy paying attention to the threats out in the world. And in many cases, kids who've been traumatized or victimized, their bodies are a source of distress, and they're actually concerned that their bodies are almost like their adversaries. It's like my body is trying to hurt me. It won't let me do things. It makes me feel scared, anxious. I feel physical pain. So in many cases, awareness of the body is actually awareness that's more distressing rather than calming, at least initially. And it's often also accompanied by just a difficulty in putting emotions into words. And as much as that's not the be-all and end-all, a lot of our ability to handle challenging, stressful situations comes from our ability to mentalize, to actually think through what we're experiencing and put our experience, including our emotions, into words, rather than just experiencing it as a kind of a diffuse onslaught. So those forms of affective or emotional and physiological dysregulation are really at the heart of this problem. If you're having that kind of a challenge with regulating your emotions and your body's homeostasis, or your body's experiencing allostasis, then you're probably going to also have some difficulties with attention. And fundamentally, this is not ADHD, as I said earlier. It may co-occur with ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But this is really fundamentally a preoccupation with threat. And there's a good deal of research with anxiety disorders, but also with trauma-related disorders that suggest that kids and adults who are experiencing these problems, they are preoccupied so that they either avoid identifying threats or they can't stop focusing their attention on the threats. And it can be an alternation between the two. And that's where you see the kid who, on the one hand, is oblivious to serious danger, and at the same time, all they can think about is, what are you going to do to get in my face and to hurt me? And they're constantly preoccupied with a sense that there's about to be something terrible that's going to happen. And that alternation can be fundamentally problematic. They also often just don't know how to protect themselves. They will try, but in many cases, their view is, after what I've been through, bring it on. Nothing you can do can make it any worse, and I'd rather get it over with, or I'd rather make it happen than wait for it to happen. I can't tell you how many kids I've worked with. Again, this is part of being an adolescent, but it's also an extreme form where they literally want to bring on the conflict because they know it's going to happen sooner or later, and if you bring it on, at least you know when it's happening. And you're in control of it happening, even if you're not in control of how it plays out. And in many cases, these kids then find ways to self-soothe that are technically maladaptive. They work in the short run, but for younger children, they can be things like rocking and just very regressive behavior. For older kids and adolescents, they unfortunately can involve addictions and other forms of just including internet addictions and social media addictions, as well as substance addictions. So self-soothing then is something that we all need and we all do, but it can become such a focus that it can become a dominant force in a person's life, in a kid's life. And that's maladaptive. They also often then will find ways to hurt themselves. Again, sometimes it's by accident, and sometimes it's very intentional. When it's very intentional, you can almost take to the bank. You have to do a careful assessment, but you can almost take to the bank that the intent is not to hurt myself. The intent is to contain this intense pain that otherwise is too much. But if I just cut my wrists, somehow I don't feel so much. Now, maybe that's partially because of endogenous opioids. We don't know that. Maybe it's because that elicits some attention and some sympathetic kinds of responses. So it might actually be a way of signaling a need for social connection. It may even elicit oxytocin. Who knows? But all we know is that it's a way of containing diffuse distress, not of causing harm. And they often are the kids who can't seem to start anything or can't seem to finish anything. And that actually we found is more common than we would have thought. Well, if that's what's going on in your behavior and in your relationships and in your emotions and your body, then it's probably going to be pretty difficult to think of yourself as anything other than pretty messed up, sadly enough. And it really doesn't matter how much people tell you you're a great person, and that helps, but that doesn't change this fundamental sense that how could I be such a great person if this is the way I feel and this is what's constantly happening in my life? And so very often they do feel a sense of having been fundamentally damaged without necessarily blaming anyone, but often blaming themselves. Of course, there's going to be a fundamental sense of insecurity in close relationships. And this is so detrimental because just what these kids need, and what we all need as adults too, the sense of soothing and security that comes from trusting, caring, responsive relationships can seem absolutely the greatest danger. It's like you let down your guard, you trust somebody, and then they leave. or this really nice nurse practitioner tells you that she or he is going to be there for you, and then the next time you go to the clinic, they're gone, and they're not there anymore, and they never said goodbye. Now, that's nobody's fault, but it's just something that we all have to be very conscious and think about. These are kids who are not just looking for a momentary connection. They're really hungry for any kind of a lasting sense of connection, and it's awfully difficult in their lives. And as a result, they're often going to be distrusting and defiant. Who wouldn't be? And they're often going to rely on aggression as a way of protest as well as a way of defense. And they're going to often have a difficult time knowing the difference between themselves and others. And so they're often going to assume that everybody thinks the same way they do, or nobody could possibly think or feel the same way that they do. And they're often going to have difficulties with boundaries, where these are the kids who, at our hospital, who would run up to anybody, any stranger, and hug them, like they were the best, closest person ever. And the staff literally had to pull them away. And of course, if you hung the wrong person out there in the world, you can end up being exploited in some very terrible ways. These are also kids who, at other times, won't let anybody get close. And that's I don't do goals, I won't talk to you about anything, we have nothing to talk about. And they're also oftentimes either they have a difficulty with feeling a sense of empathic concern for others or taking other people's perspective. And at other times, they become overly involved and enmeshed with others. And they are so empathically concerned that they can't tolerate the hurt that they feel is being done to someone else or the injustice. And that's not just a protest of injustice, that's a sense of, I'm being hurt just as much as this other person. I can't really separate myself from them. So, with all of that, that's a pretty hard thing, that's a pretty hard set of adaptations to have to live with. And yet, if that's what you need in order to protect yourself, you're going to rely on that. Well, we wanted to see if this is actually something that we could identify if we did some structured assessments. So we developed a structured interview that assesses exactly those criterion items that I just described. We did this with a sample of, first we did it with an internet sample of clinicians from all over the world, and we found that these are people from a wide variety of backgrounds. I regret to tell you that nursing was not represented there. That's an oversight on our part, or maybe we just didn't advertise correctly. And what the sample of clinicians from all over the world told us was these symptoms, I'll just give you the brief summary. If you want, you can read the article. These symptoms are different than post-traumatic stress disorder. They're related, but they're different. They are clearly associated, from the clinician's experience, with precisely the kind of victimization and attachment disruption that we had hypothesized. And they are discriminable from a wide variety of other disorders too. They're related to depression, to anxiety disorders. They're related to behavioral disorders of childhood, externalizing behavior disorders like oppositional defiant disorder, attention deficit disorder, but they're distinct enough that they actually warrant being assessed separately from any one of those disorders. Now, that doesn't prove that we have a meaningful construct here, but it's at least suggesting that that's what many, many clinicians from many different backgrounds and places found. So then we developed a structured interview. And we've assessed that now, this is the first wave of our developmental trauma field trial, with a sample of about 236 kids, sometimes interviewing the children, who ranged from early elementary school all the way through adolescence, sometimes assessing their parents, sometimes getting both perspectives when we possibly could. And you see that the sample is not a representative population sample, although it was nicely split in terms of gender, and we did get a good representation of children of color. This included kids who tended to have more extensive trauma histories than in the general population, but 1 in 11 had no trauma history whatsoever, and a small number had one type of trauma, and then a number of these kids were polyvictims, much more than you'd expect in a representative sample. But that's okay. We wanted to oversample for that. And what we found there, again, you can't read the articles yet, they're under review, but what we found was that when we did this assessment, and we also assessed for post-traumatic stress disorder as well as for a wide variety of other psychiatric disorders of childhood, that once again, these particular symptoms were discriminable from any other diagnosis. They accounted for impairments in these children and adolescents' functioning that were not accounted for by any other diagnosis, including PTSD. So we did some statistical analyses that looked at whether this is really just all PTSD with a little bit of extra added burden. If there's something more than post-traumatic stress disorder, there's something more than depression, there's something more than any anxiety disorder. The comorbidity that was most common with this developmental trauma disorder, which again is not a diagnosis yet, it's a proposed diagnosis, and it's just a clinical way of looking at and thinking about the children that we work with. That's why I would recommend it to you. This DTD syndrome was most clearly related, separate from PTSD, to oppositional defiant disorder, attention deficit disorder, and panic disorder. Those three disorders of all the childhood psychiatric disorders, and much more so, and this is independent of its relationship, or excuse me, independent of those disorders' relationship to PTSD. So basically what we found so far is that this is a syndrome that is related, and it's highly comorbid with PTSD. Kids who met criteria for developmental trauma disorder often also met criteria for PTSD, but not always. About a third of them, excuse me, more like 40% did not. But even with that overlap, there's something about these particular developmental trauma difficulties that is contributing both to impairment as well as to the likelihood of other diagnoses over and above what PTSD contributes. In other words, we need to think about these kinds of sequelae of childhood traumatization and victimization in a much broader sense than post-traumatic stress disorder, or depression, or anxiety disorders, or oppositional defiant disorders or other externalizing disorders. And that's really our plug to the field. We don't want to necessarily create a new diagnosis, although that wouldn't be the worst thing in this case. But what we do want is we want clinicians to be aware these fundamental problems with self-regulation need to be paid attention to, because you won't probably get at them by treating the more commonly identified psychiatric and behavioral health disorders of childhood. So what can you do? Well, I'm not going to show you this. This is a quote from a neuroimaging researcher, Martin Teicher, who basically says the following, that in your brain, when you experience, in this case, he was talking about maltreatment, but let's talk about any kind of childhood victimization or adversity, that there are three areas of the brain that are particularly crucial to understand. And this is a vast oversimplification on my part, but it's close enough. If you read the text, it's pretty much what he said. And what he basically said was, it all begins with an alarm in the brain, which centers on the amygdala, especially the basolateral nucleus of the amygdala, okay? It involves an adjacent area in the limbic system of the brain, the hippocampus, which we loosely, or which we colloquially call the memory filing center, because that's the area of the brain that seems to be very central. It's not the total part, or it's not the total explanation, but very central to encoding memories and retrieving memories, and especially memories that tell you the meaning or the context of an experience. Not just what happened, but what does this all mean to me? What do I know about this that actually is important rather than just what happened, okay? And the third area is the prefrontal cortex, the brain's thinking area, where we actually become able to be consciously aware of what we're feeling emotionally, of our thoughts, make plans, make decisions, solve problems. Again, multiple areas of the prefrontal cortex are involved. And what Dr. Teicher was essentially saying was that under optimal conditions, what happens when anybody experiences a stressor, a challenge, is that the alarm goes off in the brain, is activated by the sensory input that comes through the sensory gatekeeper, the thalamus. And that alarm then basically signals us to wake up and pay attention, okay? And then we draw immediately, oops, excuse me, I'm jumping ahead. We almost immediately, that information is also added to by information from the filing center, the hippocampus, which is essentially drawing on our life experiences and life lessons. And that information is conveyed to the prefrontal cortex, the thinking center, which then the crucial thing here is that activation of the prefrontal cortex is what resets the amygdala, the alarm. And if you have experienced victimization, polyvictimization, developmental trauma, you're likely to have a difficulty that takes more this form, which is a very hyperactivated alarm, which in turn then signals, or excuse me, draws on, whoops, the memory center, come back here, draws on the memory center, but we show this is for kids and adults. It doesn't exactly completely shut down the filing center, but it draws on memories that are essentially ones of threat, danger, or harm, okay? Because that's the context. And that then often does apparently crash the hard drive. And doesn't mean that we have kids who aren't smart, but it means we have kids who can't stop and think because they're too busy reacting. They can, but they don't know how to reset this alarm in their brain. So of course, when you explain this to anybody, the next question is, how do I reset this alarm? Is there a medication? You know, give me the medicine, I'll take it. Well, maybe not, and there isn't. Fortunately or unfortunately, there's no medication that changes this particular interconnectivity pattern. Is it brain surgery? Nope, that's not going to work either. Maybe neurofeedback, we'll see. That's still a possibility, but that's still pretty relatively untested. What we really need to do is we really need to harness the power of the prefrontal cortex, okay? Because that's what we've got going when we're consciously thinking. So how do we do that? Well, here's a very simple way that we've found that we didn't come up with. I just found this as a way to capture what people do, kids, adults, when they're highly stressed and they're able to regulate their emotions or recover from intense emotions. They're able to be aware of their bodies. They're able to think relatively clearly even though they're highly stressed. Think about this for yourself. You probably do this all the time when you're stressed, and it doesn't have to be traumatic stress, but it's especially important when it is traumatic stress. You probably have ways of stepping back, slowing down, becoming aware of your body, just going, wait a minute, stop. I need to just not do anything for just long enough to regroup, get my bearings before I say that next thing that's going to lead to a big argument or it's going to lead to a very difficult scene out there with that driver who I'm just about to cut off or whatever. I'm sorry about my traffic illusions. And then you probably are able to focus on one thing. And instead of trying to focus on everything and solve all the problems of the world or figure out everything about that situation, instead of problem solving, what seems to be really crucial is to go back to that sort of secure base. And this is drawing on the attachment research, but it's also drawing on research on mentalization, which is the ability to actually put what we're experiencing into words, as I said earlier. But not just to come up with any thought, but a thought that may be an image. In many cases, it's like a picture. One of the orienting thoughts that one of my colleagues loves to use when he teaches this is he shows a picture of his daughter. And he says, that's my orienting thought. I just picture Ami, and when I see her, I just come right back down. And again, this is not a relaxation exercise. It could be relaxing. This is much more of a mental focusing exercise. And it is not just an exercise either. It's really a way of actually a discipline, a way of living. And sometimes you might see some intersections with mindfulness. This is not meditation. For those of us who are not good at meditation, this is kind of another way of doing that without having to become deeply mindful meditators. If you are, that's great too. But just to focus in on one thought, and whatever it is that you most value, that's most important, and that represents who you are as a person. That's what we all do, I would submit to you, when we're able to regroup before we do or say something that we really regret. And we're not always able to do that. I'm certainly not always able to do that. But it's especially important if you need to regroup, not just because you're stressed, but because you really feel as though this is a desperate, horrible situation and you've got to do something right this moment. And then there's that burst of anger, or there's that avoidance and that shutdown, that dissociation, that running away, all those things that then become a vicious cycle that developmental trauma disorder describes. And it's very important to not only go to that place where you feel a sense of grounding and kind of inner-centeredness without necessarily having to be a deep meditator, but it's important to also then track your inner experience. And we found that the easiest way to do that is the simplest way, and that is just simply do a stress scale, stress thermometer, 1 to 10. How much stress are you feeling? And also, in addition, make an internal self-check on how much personal control you're feeling right at this moment. And we define personal control, especially for adolescents, as not the obvious, which is the ability to make everything happen exactly the way you want, and to be the king or queen of the world, which of course we all want to do, but the ability to think clearly. And I actually have not ever had an adolescent argue with me about that. Maybe they're just going along with this to be nice, but I've never worked with an adolescent, regardless of their trauma history, who has said that thinking clearly was not a good thing. They're just convinced that A, most adults don't do that, B, that they're doing it all the time, and that's why they're so angry, or that's why they don't get along with people, or that's why they don't go to school, or that's why these things happen. And for them, it's really kind of a revelation to realize that they are thinking clearly when they're able to start with what's most important to them. And amazingly enough, given that adolescents are so oppositional by job description, this has proven to be a way that many adolescents have said, they'll say, I'm not going to do your SOS. Again, most of them don't know that means save our ships. They weren't around in World War II, or whenever that phrase was coined, probably before that. But they do sort of know that SOS means something. And they'll often say, I'm not going to do your SOS, but yeah, okay. Yeah, I did have this deal the other day where the teacher looked at me in that way, and every time that happened in the past, I would just be ready to go after her or him. And I just thought to myself, SOS is stupid SOS. And I've heard more teenagers say, I hate it, but you know what? It works, darn it. They don't say darn it. Okay. We also, when we are able to work with kids or adults, including parents, because the kids often have to go teach their parents this, and that's great. We love that. We sometimes are able to work with them, and we start with this SOS, but then we help them to actually work through a series of steps where they actually unpack their stress reaction. We found that there's a way to actually recognize triggers, number one, which we're all very commonly aware of, the importance of doing that, but also to be able to identify their emotions, thoughts, goals, and choices. And we emphasize focusing first on helping them to identify the choices, the thoughts, the feelings that are most reactive. We don't start with the happy ones. We don't start with the let's be pleasant and pro-social ones. We start with, when this trigger happens, when your mom says that to you, or when your dad does that, or when the other kids do this stuff, and your alarm goes off, we don't say, so tell me how are you going to feel if you really are very focused and you're just doing a great job. We say, how do you feel? What are you feeling? Angry. I want to kill him. And we've had more situations where we've had to explain to staff and administrators that by helping kids to just articulate their thoughts and their feelings, we are not encouraging them to act on those in any way, shape, or form. And we're very careful to help them to think through, we don't say that's a bad feeling or that's a bad thought or you better not do that. We just say, okay, so that's what you're thinking. That's an option that you have. Yes, you could punch that teacher out if that's one of your choices. We're not agreeing with that, but that's a choice. But then when you're really focused on what's important to you, what's the choice that you would make? What choice would you make if you were doing this based upon what you really believe in and what's important to you? And that may seem like an esoteric conversation, but for many kids and adolescents, that actually helps them, as well as their parents and teachers and juvenile probation officers and judges and law enforcement officers and therapists and clinicians. That's often a really important shift to identify my reactive first impulses, which for us, we call that countertransference, or we call that vicarious trauma, or we call that just being stressed out by our patients or our clients. But it's really the same thing. It's just our alarm going off, essentially signaling us that there's a problem and we got to figure out what to do about it. And when we start to realize that we have choices that are reactive, but we also have choices that are based on our core values. I can say that to you, I wouldn't say that to a kid. But that's what we really are suggesting. And kids really latch onto this very quickly because they are so concerned about ethics. So we've used this intervention with some very interesting and we're very, very indebted to a large number of moms with young children, first adults in substance abuse treatment, moms with young children, girls who are getting in trouble with the law and involved in delinquency, moms and women most of them who are moms who are incarcerated. And we found that doing this intervention with each of those groups, sometimes on a one-to-one basis, sometimes in a group basis, we've also done it on a family systems basis, that it reliably leads to changes, to shifts in their ability to regulate their emotions, reductions in their sense of hypervigilance, an increase in their sense of hope. That is fundamentally what we're really trying to accomplish here. And we've even found that when we do this with kids who are in pretty serious trouble, like kids who are in juvenile detention, we did this with a large number of groups in Connecticut, and we found that for every group session where kids kind of got immersed in this approach, that in the first week of their detention, they had 54% fewer dangerous incidents over the next 2 weeks. They had 72 minutes less of seclusion. Our goal was to have none whatsoever, but we couldn't prescribe that. So for every session, these kids, most of them were boys, but there was a good subgroup of girls, they actually had far fewer incidents that were serious and led to very negative sanctions or danger. They were less likely to be secluded, and over time, their likelihood of recidivism actually decreased. And we've also done this with a large ACYF project with kids in foster care and their foster families. And we found that when this was done on an in-home family therapy basis, the master's level clinicians would go out to the families, that in the first analyses that we've been able to do, the first 36 kids who participated, we found that there was a 20% reduction in emotional dysregulation, 15% reduction in behavioral dysregulation, and a 10% increase in cognitive self-regulation, all based upon the report of the caregiver, which may be biased, and there may be just some halo effect, but those are at least the kinds of effects that we're looking for. If you want to read more about this whole issue, not that particular intervention, I do have an interest in this book, but I think it's a collection of edited chapters by some of the best experts in the field of complex trauma treatment for children. And if you want to read about it for adults, there's yet another book. So that is what I have to tell you about developmental trauma disorder. What questions or comments do you have? I think we have about 30 seconds. But I'm happy to go beyond that. Thank you. Jim.
I keep, as you describe the treatment, thinking about the kid who knows anger management but can't use it for the youth.
Right.
You're basically trying to teach them how to use top-down inhibitory control circuits, which are weak because of their developmental experience.
Yes.
Strengthen them.
Yes.
So the key aspect of your intervention to me isn't its content. How do you get them to practice so that in the heat of the moment they can use it? How do you do that?
We do that by, the question was, how do you get kids to practice this kind of the accessing of the prefrontal cortex, the top-down inhibitory input that resets the alarm? When this is actually, when that input is actually compromised by the demands that survival have put on the kid. So a lot of their cognitive and neural resources potentially are actually being deployed to hypervigilance, so they're not as available. So how do you get kids to actually do that enough so they build up this capacity, the thinking center, so to speak? The way we do it is we work with not just the kids, but the adults in their environment. And we try to basically get them, the kids, if we're only working with the kids, the families, if we can work with the whole families, the schools and teachers, if we can work with actually their schools or the facilities, if they're in a facility. We try to get everyone, and we've been somewhat successful in this, to use exactly this set of skills. So we teach this not just to the kids, we teach this to the staff, the administrators, the principals, the judges, the probation officers. We teach this to everybody we can find, and we don't just teach it based upon, this is what you got to get those kids to do. You got to get them to start thinking and stop just reacting. We teach them, no, what you've got to do is you've got to show them how to do this. You've got to model this for them. The most crucial thing we've found is when adults are modeling this, when an adult will say to a young person, I think I need to do an SOS. Would you help me do an SOS right now? And initially that feels kind of awkward to a lot of adults, but as they get the hang of it, they realize they're not basically doing self-care, even though this might be a component of self-care, which could be a good thing. But what they're really doing is they're engaging the youth, but they're showing them, I will do it. I'm not just telling you to talk the talk. I will walk the walk with you. And we also encourage them, the adults and the kids, to do this not just when they're stressed, but to do it on a regular basis. We help them develop kind of a planned schedule for when they're going to do this at transition points. So sometimes before sleep, sometimes before meals, other times before changes in activities. So we basically we help them to embed this into their daily lives, not as just a crisis management intervention where you do an SOS when you're getting really stressed out, but as a practice, a daily practice. And the more that's in the environment, wherever we work in facilities or programs, we have posters that we plaster the walls with so everybody sees this SOS. Everybody sees pictures of the brain and the different parts of the brain. So we basically try to embed it in the youth's lives and environments. And how successful we are on that, we haven't been able to measure that. That would be a really good thing to measure, but we haven't found the way to do that quite yet. So it's not a matter of they come into a group once or twice a week and we teach them the skill and they go, yeah, I'll do an SOS now, and then, man, forget about it. I'm not going to ever do this again. That would, of course, make no difference. This really becomes something that they do as a matter of practice. And a lot of times, kids will do this because they want to show the adults in their lives how they should be handling things. And they get a real kind of a mission of now, instead of showing them how ticked off I am at you and how much I don't trust you or how much you've hurt me, now their agenda is, I'm going to show you something that I know more than you know about. I know what's going on in the brain. And a lot of kids are really amazing brain scientists in that way. And they love to teach the adults. We had some kids in one of these groups where three of them were in the group. These are pre-adolescent boys who are really challenging. And they all got expelled from class and from school one day. And they came into one of these groups the next day and they said, whoa, who had a really big alarm reaction? It was our teacher. She told us to get out, and we said, "You're having an alarm reaction." She said, "What are you talking about? I don't know any, I don't want to hear about this. Is this some sort of thing, this is slang that I should know about?" So they went down to the principal's office where she sent them, and the vice principal said, "Okay, that's it. We've had it, you three are trouble. I don't want you on this campus. You're expelled." And they said to him, "You're having an alarm reaction. You need to do an SOS." And he's like, "What SOS?" So they came into the group and they were indignant. Why wouldn't this teacher and this vice principal listen to us? They should have done an SOS. They didn't need to expel us. We were just goofing around. So the group leader, of course, said, "Well, do you think that was the best time to teach your teacher and the principal?" And they said, "Well, okay, maybe not. But they should have to do this too. How come they get to get away with, they're all reactive and we're just having fun, and then they get mad and they tell us not to get." So the group leader helped them to take some of the handouts and take them back to the teacher, and they asked if they could do a demonstration, and they taught the class about the SOS in the brain and stress in the brain. And the teacher happened to talk to the group leader later, and she said, "This is the first time I've ever seen those three boys really do something constructive in class. This was a whole side of them I've never seen. They did a great job. They taught it really well, and now the whole class is using this SOS. We're all talking about the alarm in the brain." That's not the usual. We don't usually have that much success, but that's what we aim for. And the more that we as adults are doing this, so even if you don't want to teach anybody any of this stuff at all, and you're welcome to teach any of it that you'd like to, even though it's copyrighted, go ahead and use it, please. The copyrighted part is a systematic training that we do, which you don't have to do. But if you want to use it, don't use it on your spouse, partners, kids. Use it yourself, and then show them how amazingly well you can recover from stressful experiences. And maybe at some point they'll ask you for your secret. If they do, then you'll know you've got it, and you've got them too. Okay, on that I'll end. Thank you very much.